As someone who builds products for a living, I've been extremely lucky to have the opportunity to spend a lot of time advising startups and mentoring founders. I've got a bunch of friends who are also full time VCs, and the one thing we're always continuously pondering is what makes great startups great. While there are obviously very diverse perspectives and around the idea of what makes great startups great, the one thing I've seen that's consistent is it kind of depends on where in the maturity curve the startup is. So, depending on how mature your startup is across the several rounds of funding, here are the 5 things that makes a great startup great. The first thing is the idea, specifically a 10x one. And the lift-off thrust required for an idea to be 10x is extremely high. The second is the execution. It's not just important to have a 10x idea, because without a 10x execution, your idea kind of becomes meaningless. The third is monopoly, and this one comes right out of the book 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel, where he very beautifully creates the foundations for what does it mean to actually achieve a monopoly as a startup. Fourth is moats, or simply the things a startup needs to do in order to sustain itself from its competition on an ongoing basis. And then the fifth one is the ecosystem a startup needs to create around it in order to create lasting value. So let's dive deep into each of these 3 areas. The first one, which is about how do you create a 10x idea? The 3 questions that I'm constantly using to evaluate what makes an idea a 10x idea are the following. The first is if the idea really is unique enough and genuinely hasn't existed before. Robinhood here is a really good example in this case, primarily because when it was founded, absolutely nothing close to it actually existed. The average everyday investor was forced to use more complex platforms like Schwab's and E-Trade and give back commission for every single trade that they conducted. And what Robinhood did was introduce something that disrupted every single player in the space, eventually managing many more monthly active users than all of their legacy providers combined. The second is I'm looking for a really solid reason why no other company has actually done this idea yet. Founders need to come to the table with a really compelling case or an argument that kind of demonstrates an understanding of changing consumer behavior and gaps. So one of my favorite examples in this case is Sketch, which entered an unaddressed market for digital designers who were forced to design in Photoshop and InDesign, which really were tools that were meant for photographers and publishers. And finally, I'm looking for what makes the founders the right people to tackle the challenge and what skills, experience, or knowledge do they bring to the table that can make them the best people to tackle this challenge. The best founder teams not only bring in a great vision or an idea, but also the ability and experience to execute upon that vision and the idea. Which brings us to a 10x execution. First, I'm looking for what we call an experience differentiator, which simply is, does the startup introduce a radical new way or a radical new experience that currently does not exist in the market? The experience differentiators that Uber introduced were the ability to hail a cab with the tap of a button, or tracking your cab, or even getting out of a cab without the hassle of actually pulling your credit card in order to make a payment. The second part to a really good idea in terms of execution is if the team has actually successfully found product market fit across, a certain market or a certain type of segment of users, and do the current users actually show signs of persistent use of the product. Stitch Fix is a really good example here for an experience where users directly saw value with frequent use of the product, which eventually led them to increase the loyalty of the brand and then eventually adding to the wallet spend. And then the third part to a really good execution is if your users are willing to pay for the service if they had to, which also is a really great way of testing product fit. Products that truly add meaningful value to its users command a certain feeling in return from the users who would willingly want to pay to use the product or service because it adds so much value to their lives. The third big thing is monopoly, and monopoly significantly increases the chances of a startup actually being great. And these are the 4 things that Peter Thiel himself actually suggests. The first thing is if a company has invented a piece of technology that takes its competitors a really long time to actually catch up to them. I really love the example of Tesla here, which pretty much had like a 17-year-old head start. And despite it being 17 years, we're yet to see a really solid competitor on the road from some of the biggest automobile companies in the world. And I know that Ford and Merck have a bunch of great cars, but none of them are actually operating at the scale at which Tesla is operating right now. Then you have network effects, or generally social networking platforms that become more valuable at scale, kind of comes to mind. TikTok is a really good example that's blowing up right now, and it's only going to become bigger and bigger as more people begin to join. Next, you have economies of scale, and software startups here generally steal the cake in this genre, primarily because it's really hard to scale a startup that has a physical, an analog, or even a logistical thing involved. And Notion comes to mind, which is one of my absolute favorite examples here, that apart from being a software-only startup and the scale being inherent to the way that they managed to kind of mean several different things to several different segments of users in many, many different contexts. And this is extremely hard to do, which kind of makes it an incredible example that kind of demonstrates economies of scale beyond just the ability to scale a product in different markets. And finally, it's brand equity. When the word a thermostat comes to your mind, the one company that you always think of is Nest. And that product is so incredible that no other brand even comes close to actually taking the cognitive share in the customer's mind. And that's what brand equity kind of is all about. On to the fourth big thing, which makes great startups great, is moats. Being able to attract exceptional talent and effortlessly retain them, primarily because you've built a rocket ship that will eventually pay out its dividends in good time, but also for the future your company or your startup actually promises. And to be able to attract talent in that context is significantly differentiating relative to all your competitors, and kind of what a startup actually needs in a very early stage environment. The next one is data, or being able to understand your user behavior in such a differentiated way that no other competitor can even come close to replicating the richness of the data lake that you actually have been collecting. An incredible culture is the third one, or companies that, don't focus too much on the yoga babble involved, but are actually authentic, scalable, and unique environments that attract some incredible people into them who come in and actually reshape the environment by adding their values and adding their principles within the environment. And finally, being able to either ward off or attract big tech successfully. Because whether you like it or not, the 5 big tech players play a significant role in your startup or your startup's ability to achieve scale. The last big thing that comes to mind is, or rather the last big thing that makes great startups great, is the ecosystem a startup manages to create around itself and the stakeholders or other companies that it's kind of interacting with. The first question to ask here is if the startup has the ability to create parallel accentuators. Uber is a really great example here, primarily because what they're essentially doing is they're taking the same infrastructure that they've built of getting people from point A to point B in a car and applying it to literally every other parallel logistical or movement problem, like the food delivery business or airways or freight or even public transit systems. The second question that I'm asking is if a startup has the ability to scale or naturally enter complementary industries. And I love the example of Airbnb in this case, that not only went on to disrupt the hospitality industry, but is beginning to find new and unique opportunities to enhance your Airbnb experience through products like experiences and adventures. And finally, does the scale of your startup provide shared value to participants within the ecosystem? And Airbnb, again, is an exceptional example here, which kind of has managed to create more than 1,800 other startups around the world. So that's pretty much it. The 5 big things that make great startups great. The 10x idea, a 10x execution, the ability to create a monopoly, the ability to ward off your competition by creating moats around your business, and the ability to create a big enough ecosystem that not only adds value to your own company, but also creates shared value externally and for other people within the ecosystem. The value of a startup is entirely dependent on the differentiation it manages to create in each stage across its maturity curve. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment below if you have thoughts, and we can keep the conversation going. And I'll see you in the next one.